My name is Varvara Shmygalova, and I'm the head of the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center in Kyiv. Ever since the annexation of Crimea and start of the Russian-Ukrainian war, we've been working on counteracting Russian malign information operations in Ukraine and also letting our allies know about the malign activities happening in their space and influences that Russia is making to the public opinion in their countries. We believe that information is power, and sharing the truth about Russian action and its nature is our front in this war. Can you guess what this is? My first thought that it actually looked like another planet or the scene from a Hollywood sci-fi movie. But no, it's Mariinka, 29 kilometers from Donetsk. And this is the result of the Ruski Mir coming to my homeland. For the reference, this is Mariinka before Russian occupants razed it. And what does Russia offer to its loyal subjects? So the first thing that comes to mind, especially to Westerners, is great Russian culture, St. Petersburg, Moscow City, Hermitage. When in reality, life in Russia and Russian Empire is still closer to this. And this, just for the reference, the wooden barracks built in Arkhangelsk in 1930s. They were not really rebuilt or fixed after that. The last kind of renovation that happened were 50 years ago. This is how regular Russians live. So the only scenario that Russia offers and can deliver is destruction, poverty, inequality, and hardship. So unless you want your home to resemble this, don't call on the Russian world. And I will now present the main topic of my presentation, which is 5 reasons why Russia should dismantle. And the first reason for that is that the only group of people who benefit from the status quo are actually Putin's regime and his oligarchs. The rest of Russian subjects suffer from poverty, as we already mentioned, and we heard from other speakers today that living in not metropolitan Russian area is actually quite awful. And that happened because Russia accumulates all the goods and resources in the metropole, Moscow and St. Petersburg, draining them from the rest of the occupied territories. And this leads to extreme corruption, social injustice, stratification, and poverty. So right now you see on the slide just a few stats that I collected. I'm not going to name all of them, but just one of the ones that really probably sound bad for Westerners, that only every 10th Russian doesn't have a toilet at home at all, and then every 4th Russian doesn't have a sewerage system, right? Also, Russia is one of the largest suppliers in natural gas in the world. However, in the rural areas, only 20% of the households are gasified. And just to mention that Russia actually would rather burn the gas as it does now because of the sanctions rather than to give it to its own people. And another one is that Russia is among top 5 countries with the highest rate of HIV spread, and it's actually overtaking Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya on this matter. Moving on, this is where all the money goes. This is palace in Gelendzhik that belongs to Putin. Everyone probably knows about it because of Navalny and their film about that. And moving on to my next point is that there are no human rights or rule of law for the 145 million people who currently live on the territories of Russia. Unlawful fines, arrests, repressions, and prosecutions are an expected norm. So as you can see, in 2023, Freedom House actually rate Russia as not a free country, and it's at historical low of 16 points of 100. That means that Russia has neither political rights nor civil liberties. It does not have the electoral process, functional government, freedom of expression and belief, or rule of law. That brings me to my next slide about all the cases and people who were prosecuted, unlawfully arrested, or put in prison just for speaking truth in Russia. Also, Russia spreads its violence and unlawfulness everywhere it can reach. So, after the liberation of the right bank of Kherson region, 20 torture chambers and places where Ukrainian prisoners were kept by Russian military were discovered. 5 of them were in Kherson. Some of them were specifically dedicated to kids. Also, the Commissioner of Verkhovna Rada for Human Rights reported that there may be about 150,000 children who were illegally stolen out of Ukraine by Russia. Russia actually reports that that number is about 700,000, but we believe that it's a bit inflated. Most of the children were stolen from occupied territories of Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. And we can go on and on about that, but just to mention that over 68,000 war crimes were already reported as of March 2023, and the number of these crimes will go on and get higher the longer the war comes. So the manipulation of the law to suit those in power or the absence of law altogether cannot exist in a free and equal society. Next point is that Russian metropolitan politics and actions towards enslaved nations could and should be classified as genocide and therefore must be stopped. And we heard from a lot of people that represent these nations today that this is indeed happening. And the elements of those genocide is abolition of indigenous cultures, languages, and identities. And we heard that some of those regions already lost their languages and their culture. It's a forceful assimilation and economic exploitation. And by economic exploitation, I mean the extraction of resources without reasonable investment into regional or local economies, infrastructure, and social programs. And coming to the last point in this is actually ethnic cleansing. Use of Russian-Ukrainian war as an instrument of that cleansing. Indigenous communities experiencing way higher level of poverty combined with the absence of social lifts for indigenous people created an incentive to enslaved nations to enlist in the army, which resulted in increased losses in colonized communities. Establishment of a new propaganda narrative that all the war atrocities in Ukraine are committed by uncivilized indigenous people, not white European Russian soldiers, is also really circulating a lot within Russian community and in Ukraine, that even more underline the issue that Russia as an empire sends the enslaved nations to die in Ukraine and then use it as a reason why actual Russians are not that bad. That brings me to the next point, that indigenous nations cannot survive, preserve their language, culture, and identity under the Russian Empire. And this is just a few narratives that Russia often uses, like imperial narratives, to push its agenda. You can read them. I'm not going to voice all of them now. I'm actually going to stop particularly on the one that is oppression of minority rights. So this narrative were used by Russians a lot in Ukraine, but also in other countries. But this propaganda narrative were used to destabilize the situation. So specifically, they claim that so-called oppression of the rights of Russian-speaking people is oppressive. They try to similarly frame the narrative about the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, when in fact, in Russia itself, the rights of minorities are mostly ignored or frowned upon. Russia used the same colonial tools against Ukraine, both during their imperial and Soviet periods. The efforts to destroy Ukrainian identity and statehood failed. Therefore, we can view the current war as an act of revisionism that will also fail in the result of metropole destruction. Enslaved nations of Northern Eurasia should use the Ukrainian experience of successful resilience to liberate themselves and establish sovereign nation states. Decolonizing the post-Russia space and creating sovereign nation states and regional economic alliances is the only way to ensure the future of these indigenous people. That brings me to my last point, actually, that Russia always has been the main destabilization factor in the region. And as you can see in this infographic that I, again, wouldn't explain in all details, but we're talking after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia presumably were already kind of democratic federation. The only year that Russia was in peace and didn't fight anyone and didn't participate in any military conflicts is actually 1998, as you can see. And that's enough to prove the point that Russia is always the bad guy. They are the reason that all this happens in the region and in the world, and therefore only the full elimination of such actor from the international arena can ensure the peaceful and progressive development of the region. And just to summarize my points, and I'm welcoming your questions if you have any, this is a citation of the prominent Russian fighter for the freedom, Valeria Novodvorska, that she said in 2014, already after the annexation of the Crimea, temporary annexation, Russia is an empire. There is no empires of good. There is only evil empires. Let us all ensure that the last empire of Eurasia will finally fall. Thank you so much.